Hi, it's Monday morning right after Tisha B'Av, so the Avils is not over totally yet, as you know, till Chatzos today, and I'm gonna try once again to coordinate the audio and the video as I do try to do the Parsha of something on the Parshas Va'eschanan. As you know, this is being sponsored, the last of the sponsorships of Mishpacha Sasson from Teaneck, which is in honor, it says, of his daughter Ayelet, who graduated Mayanot High School. That's all over there in Teaneck. Became an EMT. Oh, is moving to Israel and makes a Kiddush Hashem wherever she goes. She's making Aliyah. Well, um, so thank you. I don't have any sponsors yet for the rest of the week for the Haftorah and for the history. We'll see. Maybe somebody will step forward. And now, just I started looking at Parshas Va'eschanan, and this year I look a little bit more Rashi. And one second over here. Okay, no, I hope that's okay. Performance issues. Anyhow, for no Shantem. We just read yesterday. What I'm going to do today is like a little bit connected still with Tisha B'Av. That's why I mentioned it's still the morning after Tisha B'Av. And just struck me, and I'll share to you what I thought. And we have yesterday we all read, as everybody knows, Kisoli, Bani, 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 Bano Shantem, Bahartina, that whole thing, which is what you read in the morning of Tisha B'Av, of course. And so I'm looking at it now, and it's a famous Rashi. All the Rashis here are famous. And it's based on the Gemara, in Gittin, where Agadato, where it says V'no Shantem should come out to 852, and God was supposed to really keep everybody in Israel and only exiled them after 852 years, and instead he exiled them after 850 years. He jumped ahead by 2 years, and this is supposed to be a chesed. This is based on where the Rashi basically says V'no Shantem Ramas lahem sheyiglu mimenu l'sof shmeya shmona meim b'chamishim shana. There's a remez over here, no Shantu, the gematria, that they're supposed to leave after for 852 years. In other words, the first Beis Hamikdash, the first Tisha B'Av, Beis Hamikdash should take place 852 years after they entered Israel. Communion no Shantem v'hu hikdim v'higlam l'sof shmona meos b'chamishim. But God moved it up, and instead, the actual exile took place, the Tisha B'Av took place 850 years, not 852 years. In order that the pasuk shouldn't be fulfilled, because the pasuk goes on to say as follows: Kisoli bani b'nei bani no shantem barts, when you belong in Israel, v'shchatem v'asisem pesel tmunas kol, and you'll do all kind of idol worship. V'asisem arab b'nei Hashem la'achiso, and you get God angry. Haidosi b'chem hayom v'seshmayim v'saretz. So I call to testimony, Moshe Rabbeinu says in this week's parsha, heaven and earth, ki avot tovidim maher, me'al artz asher tamar b'siyarin sham l'rishta, that you'll be lost from the land, you'll be lose Eretz Yisrael pretty quickly. Lo sarichun yamim olel ki shamatim shibudim. You won't spend a long time there because you'll be utterly wiped out. So the idea generally goes that this is a favor, a chesed. The plain way of reading this is that Hashem says, I'm going to kick you out before you reach the full level of idol worship, full level of sin. Because once you live the full level, then you'll be irredeemable. You understand? The case will not be remediable. But if I take you out prematurely, so you'll not have totally lost all your zechusim to be in Israel. You won't have, hit the 50th Shari Tumah, let's use that language, and you'll still be, salvageable. And that's what happened, of course, because since they left early, so they only had a temporary exile of 70 years, and they were able to come back for round two. That's the basic idea over here. And it's very sad, okay? Very pessimistic, but the whole book of Devarim is pretty doggone pessimistic if you take the trouble to read it. And Moshe Rabbeinu, as he leaves, he says, I know once I'm gone, Achri Mosi Hashchis Hashchisim and Arts, and all that. I mean, in other words, like a father, and I always say this every year, like a father trying to look at the children and knowing they're a bunch of losers, but he's on his deathbed and he says, don't run my business into the ground and keep it on top of the accounts and, make sure your records are good and do what you need to do, keep the business going, even though he knows in his heart that these kids are going to run the business into the ground. So, and that's happened. Okay? Now, there's two aspects of this. I hope I remember what I wanted to say. The first one is really pretty pessimistic or pretty shocking because 850 years of Avodah Zarah? Tosas asks this question because it's all from a Gemara in Gittin at the end of Gittin. That's what Rashi's quoting from. And, it's an Agadatah. And basically, what it's very frum interpretation, as you would expect from Rashi, on the Gemara also. How does it go over here? On Gittin 88, page Ches, where it says, Vayishkad Hashem al Arash Vayivel Aleinu Ki Tzadik Hashem Aleinu Tzadik Hashem Aleinu. So it's a funny pasuk in the book of Daniel, and the pasuk usually sounds like God hastens. I wrote it out. I printed it, highlighted it. Vayishkad Hashem hastened the calamity, and He brought it upon us, for He is charitable. Okay, so again, Vayishkad Hashem. This is Daniel chapter 9. Vayishkad Hashem al Ra'ah. So God hastened the calamity. Vayaviel and brought it on us. Ki Tzadik Hashem Elokeinu, because God is righteous. Now, the usual way, the Hebrew language is so plastic. You can go a lot of different ways. So what does it mean? He brought upon us the calamity because He's a tzaddik. So tzaddik could mean righteous, or tzaddik could mean kind, merciful. It can mean that, right? So righteous, in other words, righteous goes both ways. Righteous means I deal with you exactly as you deserve, righteous in that way. Tzaddik as opposed to chassid. Or tzaddik could mean kind and nice, you see somebody's a tzaddik or God's a tzaddik, you don't only mean in this legal sense of a midas hadin that, He keeps you to exactly, you get what your grade is and no higher. And here, it's the idea that tzaddik is charitable or merciful. And that would be the basis of the Chazal saying, again in the Gemara over here, Shehigla tzedakah asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu im Yisrael, Shehigla golos tzidkiyahu, v'adayin golos yichon yakayemes, tichsiv, and goes on and on. So basically the idea, the way Rashi presents it is that, and again, this is the day after Tisha B'Av, I'm saying this, that, how should I put it? There was two Galuyos, Yehoiachin and then Tzidkiyahu, 10 years apart. This is the fame, and in the teachings of Chazal and the rabbinic literature, when Yehoiachin was exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, which was round 1, 10 years before round 2 of Tzidkiyahu, so the elites of the kingdom of Judah were exiled with him. And who are the elites? In rabbinic literature, it's the Sanhedrin. So to use modern terminology, the yeshivas and the Rosh Yeshivas picked up and moved from Jerusalem to Babylonia 10 years prior to the rest of the Jews coming there. It's a famous rabbinic teaching. And the idea is that that way, when the Jews, in time 10 years later, Tisha B'Av, were exiled to Babylonia, whoever survived, which is very few, they came to a going concern that there already was in Bavel, as we would say today, a frum neighborhood, and there were day schools and yeshivas and Beis Yaakovs and that kind of thing. And because of that, now this is me talking, because of that, so the exiles from Tisha B'Av, the Golos Tzidkiyahu, they were able to find chinuch in Babylonia. And the connotation is that things were better than they had been back in the kingdom of Judah. So here you have exiles bereft of land and property and pretty much enslaved until they got to Babylonia. You never know what happened with the Jews when they came to Babylonia, because the funny thing is that they don't seem to have been slaves, and yet they were captives when they were taken from Jerusalem. So either you say Nebuchadnezzar was kind-hearted and freed them once they got to Babel. Maybe, it's a little funny that a guy like him was a real son of a gun, would do that. It could be. The other possibility is, strikes me anyway, I don't know, I'm just trying to analyze it, that when the Jews from round 2, in other words, from the Golos of Tzidkiyahu, come to Bavel, the other Jews ransom them. is it possible to do so? Doesn't seem like there was a lot of people involved. I think in Jeremiah it says there were like 850 Jews, which is a shocking figure. And let's say there was more than that. But it was doable, and the Jews in Bavel ransomed them. After all, by that time, if you do the numbers, Daniel was already like prime minister or some macher in the government. I know it sounds funny, but if you do the numbers and the figures, you see that. So again, Nebuchadnezzar had a from prime minister or minister in the cabinet at least, and maybe they pulled shtick to get the captives freed. But the point is that there already was a tashtit, there always was a Jewish infrastructure there. And Rashi, like putting in the very frum way, Rashi says that therefore there were yeshivas for them to learn in. How's he put over here? Oh, mitnei. I know it's here. That they had the Golos Hikiyahu, and they were able. Here you go. That Zui Tzedakah Shemihir Vehechrib Beso, that God moved up the destruction of Beis Hamikdash by 2 years, Kedei Lahaglos Dorosh Al Tzidkiyah LeBavel, to move the people of round 2 to Babylonia, Ba'od Shechachmei Golos Yichonyo Kayamin, so that the elites were still alive from round 1, Shilamdu Torah Le'ela Golam Achreim, so they could teach the people from round 2, Visharov Chachmei Torah Golim Yichonyo. Most of the Chachmei Torah went with the elites of the round 1. Because we're told, as you know very well, that when it was the Golos Yehoiachin, the first one, round 1, it included the Charsh and the Maskir, which Pashup Shop means the armaments makers and the defense industry, which is the Pashup Shop. But, in rabbinic literature, it also means the Chachamim. And the bottom line is there was somebody to welcome them, so to speak, and from them out, because indeed it happened, at least as far as we can tell, that the Jews in Babylonia dropped Avodah Zarah. Now, the Gemara said, I saw this yesterday in Abishutz, and I don't have it in front of me. I left my copy in Shul of the Yaris Tavash. But if you look in very interesting Drush Zion, in other words, in volume 1 of Abishutz, in the 7th Drush, which is all about him talking about the Jewish calamity of 1745 when the Jews were kicked out of Prague, and he escaped it, but he was crying over it. And I did a whole bunch of podcasts about the history of the exile of Prague and how the other Jews elsewhere, the court Jews, sprung into action to try to ameliorate that. About a half a year ago, I think. So in that, he talks, among other things, the Yaris Vash goes on and on and on and on, but very brilliantly, about the fact that he's comparing and contrasting that Bayis Rishon versus Bayis Sheni, and the point, it's no good to you and me, then Bayis Rishon, he says that when they went to Babel, Hisnachmu al Avodah Zarah, that they started to have second thoughts about the idolatry, and they kind of had nechama, they regretted having done the idolatry that previously, and consequently, you had a change of mood of the Klal Yisrael. He has a whole thing on that. Niskalu Avonam, Niskalu Kitzam, that because they came to understand how wrong they had been by worshiping idols when they were in Gullus and Bavel, therefore they were able to have a kates, a limited time, a period of the Gullus, because the whole point of Gullus is what's the right word? Instructive, purgative. It's not simply a punishment. The Jews should recognize their errors. And if they do that, then they'll go back to Eretz Yisrael. And by Sheni with Sinas Chinim, when we haven't recognized the errors yet, etc., 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 you see how that drasha is working. It's very good. Which, by the way, would mean that when they say the Anshe Yesod Gedola got rid of the Yitzhar Avodah Zarah, which I know I'm talking about in the Gemara in Yuma, so it has to mean, interestingly, that the following happened. The Jews were addicted to Avodah Zarah by Bayis Rishon, as we'll see in a second. Then they had Charata in Golis Bavel. Then they returned to Israel and started building Beis Hamikdash. And then there must have been signs of a resurgence of Avodah Zarah, and that freaked them out, properly so. And Therefore, the Sanhedrin, the Anshe Sigdola, prayed to God to just change the rules and get rid of the Yetzer Avodah Zarah because it's coming back. So no, it's not that it was there all the time, but it was coming back. That's a very interesting scenario. And what it means is that they had charata and baba. Why would that be? How could it be for 800 years, 850 years, you don't have charata, you're doing avodah zarah all the time, and now in baba you have a change of mind, unless you say that the situation of the Gullus was such that first came round one, then came round two, and round one included all the yeshivas, and therefore in Babel there was, like I say, a whole infrastructure, a chinuch infrastructure, to use modern terminology, and they succeeded in re-educating. You hear what I said? Re-educating and brainwashing in a good way the exiles from Judah who came in round two. So then the whole thing is like a chesed, so to speak. Now that's my understanding, that's the larger picture of this Agadata. So if in Oshantim Ba'aretz, if 852 years, it would have been impossible. The way Rashi portrays it, the yeshivas wouldn't have been around then, or for some reason, I don't know why. But in Oshantim, they got out early, so the yeshivas and Baba were there, and that was able to turn things around. So notice it's a major episode, a major influence. And I'm sure when people were destroyed and killed and massacred by Nebuchadnezzar and all this other junk, and Bayis Rishon, it was looked at as a catastrophe, and of course it was a catastrophe, no question about it. And it is a human, suffering thing, and that's why we mentioned it yesterday in the keynotes, all the massacres that took place with Nebuchadnezzar at the time of Bayis Rishon, no question about that. It was a catastrophe. But as they say, the cloud had a silver lining in that it sort of purged. It allowed the survivors to adopt a different attitude, and that different attitude was absolutely necessary if they're going to have a second chance. Otherwise, they would not get a second chance. That's what the Rashi means when he says that, how's it go over here? What's the expression? Kadesh is kaim to avot tevedun. So it shouldn't be a complete destruction, because then they'd be, off totally. Now, by the way, avot tovidim in arts, they would lose the land. They would be happy to do so. They totally assimilate. So the modern equivalent, as I understand it, would be there are Jews who are like totally divorced, many Yiddishkeit whatsoever, and there's not a chance that they're ever going to go back. And they really won't. So avot tovedun, they'll be lost to Yiddishkeit and to the Jewish people, and they don't care. I hate to say it, as I always do, but most Jews today or many are like that. They're lost and they don't care, either through intermarriage or assimilation, or they join the Jewish Voice for Peace, one of these anti-Israel organizations, and so on and so forth. And they indeed, number one, are lost from Israel and don't mind it. In other words, as you know, many people right now, as we speak, say there should not be an Israel, and the Jews should go back to Gaulus, and that's the right way it should be. And everything else connected with Zionism and all the rest of it is a worse sin, and the Jewish people are better off without it, etc., etc., etc. So we see this now, and what they're saying over here, looking in retrospect, was it didn't turn out to be V'no Shantem, as it says in Va'eschanan. There was a whole 852 years, because then the whole process would have spun to its logical conclusion, as is the case today with so many Jews. The process of assimilation has reached its logical conclusion. So let's put it this way. By this time, their children and grandchildren are not Jewish anymore and don't care. You understand? So that's V'no Shantem avot tovedun maher. If you allow the process of the assimilation to unfold, the destructive assimilation, not the constructive assimilation. I just did a series on that. If you allow it to unfold to its logical conclusion, avot tovedun maher, then you're taka lost. And avot tovedun, I would say, number one, you're lost, and number two, tovedun, and you're happy with the loss, meaning you don't care. There's somebody today who has, who's not Jewish at all and has Jewish ancestors, whatever. Does that matter? In America or in Spain or Portugal or anywhere else around the world, does it matter? Ukraine. Does it matter to them that they have some kind of Jewish identity way back in the DNA? No. So avot tovedun menaher me'al arts lo sarichin yamecha leho ki hishameti shamidun. I mean that would be total shmad. I mean, there you have it. So Moshe Rabbeinu is saying this 3,000 years ago, but of course you see it right now. Okay, you see it in every period in Jewish history. And the other side of this that struck me was that you have a catastrophe, but the timing may turn out in the long run to show that it was, yes, a catastrophe, but also had, as they say, a silver lining. I'm thinking, of course, of October 7th, because it's a catastrophe, and it's an ongoing catastrophe. This war's going for 2 years now. It is a terrible catastrophe, and I'm well aware of the losses, both physically in terms of killed and maimed, and psychologically. Believe I get it, and it ain't over. It seems like it goes on and on and on. And I know all the terrible things that the other guys, the Hamas did, showing the videos yesterday, whatever it was, of these people like looking like concentration camp inmates, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I get it, uh, but think about this. It hit, and you know this because we're all alive now. It hit on October 7th, 2023. That was right in the middle of all these demonstrations that were getting out of hand. By that I mean the judicial reform and the whole business that went over there was an unbelievable period in Klal Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. And as I recall, the Hafganot were getting bigger and bigger. And as I recall, the Hafganot were getting more and more close to the edge of violence. You know, it never got to the point where one side went against the other violently, not as I recall. But it was up and close and personal over a law issue. Should they change the judicial system in Israel or not, the Supreme Court system or not? And basically, you'd say today, from a evil point of view, the Hamas jumped the gun. Now, that's true in a military sense, it seems, because of what happened in Syria and the fact that Hamas has complained until now that Iran and the others didn't join them on October 7th, October 8th. That's true. I'm not talking about that. That's a separate schmooze. I'm talking about from the internal. It seems to me, and probably to a lot of others, if you're thoughtful, I think, that if they hadn't hit on October 7th, but just remained passive, you get like a civil war in Israel among the Yehudim, because the right versus the left versus the right. And it's not even it's not even about drafting yeshiva guys. It was over the right versus the left and the hatred for Bibi, and he generates hatred. He's got that kind of personality. And so it was mamish getting out of hand. And I'm not going to say that it's a good thing that this came and popped that balloon, the shocking attack on October 7th, because it is catastrophic, but it has that silver lining, I think, that at least it took the air out of the balloon for a while. Now, I'm well aware that right now it's getting bad again, and feelings are very big. But I don't think you have the same kind of large group that's anti as you had before October 7th of the judicial reform. I'm well aware that there's large groups that disapprove of the government's conduct of policy, and I get it, especially people with the Chatufim and the parents and the relatives are the ones that are still left behind. And it is a highly divisive issue, and I do understand that. And that's exactly why Hamas is playing that card for all they can. They're playing that card for all they can. And if I were them, I would do the same thing. But because it's a fault line in Israel, and it just is, at a human being level. But I think the people that feel as violently about this issue are not as large as the broad public in Israel that reluctantly supports the war, I think. Meaning, nobody wants their kids to be in the fighting, and it goes on and on and on. And I get it, and it grinds down. But I think there is still a large consensus that this has to be won somehow or other against Hamas and Gaza. I don't know how they could possibly do it. But there is that feeling that's still there. Maybe that'll change over time. But as long as you have that essential consensus, so the dangers of the violent assault that was there before October 7th is not there, at least not yet. I hope I'm right, and I think I am. In which case, when you look back now, in a couple years from now, you'll say, it was almost like a certain, what's the right word? Like a certain chesed, even though it's a weird way of using the word chesed to talk about October 7th, but you know what I mean? That it stopped the carriage from riding down, careening down the mountain and smashing at the end. Because that's the way we were headed, and it's easy to do so. I just wanted to tell you that if you look at, this is just an interesting and sad aspect. In addition, Tosus in over here in Gittin over there in Peches says 852 years they were 850 years they were doing Avodah Zarah. I mean, David Melch wasn't over there. They weren't over there Avodah Zarah all the time. Vim Tomar, he the shenichzes Lord Achiyatzu Yesh Kol Kach. Maybe it was 850 years from the time of Joshua. They weren't worshiping Avodah Zarah all the time. And Omari, Satosa's answers, that's not true. There was idol worship from day one, from the time of Joshua. It says that Joshua worshiped God and all the rest of it. It can only, as I understand it, it can only mean that you had Ovdei Avodah Zarah among Klal Yisrael from the beginning. And they were doing it, the others weren't stopping them. It's just it wasn't the rove. And a little by till over the course of time, it was the rove, as we know. That's why Tisha B'Av happened. So the biblical period is described, at least by Tos over here, as a highly problematical one, as I make the case every time that you read the Nevi'im. So this is all food for thought. I hope that the strife in Israel will not get out of hand. Maybe I'll talk about that a bit later when we talk about Tu B'Av. But it seems to me that we had a shtickle no shantem, with October 7th. And that if it would have gone all the way, chas v'shalom, we could have avot tovidim and arts. So I hope that that's the divine plan and the meaning of all this. I'm not privy to that. But it does seem that that's what happened. Anyway, that's my opinion. I don't want to go too long. Once again, I want to thank Mishpacha Sasson for sponsoring 4 episodes. Again, out of their daughter Ayelet. And if I understand correctly, she made Aliyah, then I wish her a mazel and all the rest of it. And I hope somebody will step forward for the rest of the week. And with that, I wish you a good day.